Paul Mooney, thank you very much for joining Danwei TV. You've been a correspondent in China since the early 80s and have been in Asia since the Vietnam War, so I thought we'd talk today a little bit about your experiences and the way foreign reporting has changed in China over that time.
Sure.
Tell me, how did you first come to Asia?
Well, I was in the Army, I was in Vietnam in the Army in 1968 to 1970. I was just 18 years old then. And I was very keen to learn about the war, and I read a lot of books on the Vietnam War, which were written by journalists, and hadn't gotten to university yet, but when I went back, I majored in East Asian Studies, and my goal then was to be a journalist. I was impressed with what some of the reporters had done in Vietnam.
And how did you get your break starting to work in China?
I really worked my way up from the bottom. I couldn't, I got out of college, I couldn't find a job because I didn't have any journalism experience, and it was tough in those days. I was from New York. Eventually, a friend of mine got me a job at Newsweek, in a very low position. I was in the photo library, just filing photos, black and white in one section, and color slides in the other. And eventually I went from there to being a photo researcher, to being a news clipper, to being a news researcher, to doing my first reporting. But it took me about 5 years. But this was at Newsweek, where it's 5 years working your way up is probably not considered a long time. But
it was a slow hierarchical.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't have done any reporting for Newsweek if I just come in from the outside like that. It was in New York, so.
And what was it like reporting in China in the early 80s?
In the 80s, I came here in 1983. I was working for Newsweek in New York. I came out just for a month to help out in the Beijing bureau. It was kind of difficult. I remember the bureau chief wanted to do a feature story on the Great Wall, but you couldn't leave Beijing without permission. It's like later on when journalists needed permission to travel outside of Beijing to another province, we needed to get permission from that local provincial government or city government. In those days, to even leave Beijing City, you needed permission. So I think it was a lot more difficult then. Of course, there were fewer people to talk to or to interview.
Most people weren't really willing to speak to journalists.
No. I remember talking to people on the street, even in '89. Well, prior to June 4th, they were willing to speak, but as soon as June 4th came, then people clammed up. That fear came back again. So, but the late 80s was like I wasn't here as a reporter then, except for the June 4th period. I was here for about a month then, but there was a kind of a golden or a Beijing spring around 1988 when the media was just opening up, the Chinese media, and obviously there were more people for foreign journalists to interview.
And how would you compare that Beijing spring to this Beijing spring?
I think, well, in terms of the intellectual discussion among Chinese, it's nowhere near what it was then. It was an amazingly open period. But in terms of foreign journalists having access to people to talk to, experts, scholars, people who will actually talk to you frankly, well, it's improved considerably. It was tough getting interviews back in those days, and now there are many, many more people at the major universities or in society or experts who are willing to talk to you. So that's one big difference. But I think in terms of the media or the kind of public debate, I think it's less than it was in that little window that we had back in '89, which ended with June 4th.
And what's your take on foreign media bias about China?
Maybe it's because I'm a journalist. I'm a little bit sensitive to this. My feeling's been that I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I kind of don't think there is a bias. I think that we report. I would report the same things in the U.S. that I would report here. For example, I was watching CNN the other day, and they had a report from CNN talking about a lot of children in Iraq being born with deformities, and the report was quite opening, saying this could be the U.S. military. Maybe they use some kind of chemicals. And it was a long report and went on. I said, wow, we'll never see a report like that here in China by the Chinese media. And it was pretty tough. And even I thought, so, well, how do we know it's the U.S. military? We have no idea. It's, a lot of kids being born with these problems. And one doctor even said, maybe it's just more reporting of this type of thing. I don't know. But in the U.S., you can have this kind of reporting, and we can have it here. And I think when things like this get reported here, then people tend to be a bit more sensitive. But I mean, I think, Barack Obama has a much tougher time with the American media than Hu Jintao does. That doesn't mean there's not biases. I mean, I think a lot of the foreign journalists here, we have kind of liberal backgrounds. We're concerned about human rights. And yeah, if you look at my website, and you go down all the stories I've done, you'll probably find that 90% of them, at least the government would consider they were negative, But yeah. So I don't know.
90% negative, 10% positive.
It depends on whose side. If you're the average Chinese person, if you're a petitioner or a human rights lawyer, then you might think it's positive. But if you're the government, then you'll think it's negative.
But how much of a responsibility exists for the Western media, let's say the American media, to inform on their publics on other sides of China. I don't think that it's the job of the Western media to do propaganda for the Chinese state.
Right.
But last night, just the latest in a long line of people who was the first time visitor to China said to me he was surprised by how vibrant and kind of happy Beijing seemed. He was expecting everybody to be good, full of nasty communists everywhere.
Sure.
And I do think there's something in the way editorial decisions are made in the American media, let's say, that somehow does not reflect the reality of China to the majority of news consumers. Is that something that can be changed, or is that just the nature of the news business?
I think if that's the case, I don't think it's an editorial decision back in New York or Washington or London. I think it's more that, like I said, that reporters kind of, it's the human rights story that's sexy. It's the scandal. It's the corruption. Those types of things are things that attract reporters' interest. I'd also say that I think, those are the stories that people notice more. And I know what you mean. I've had visitors come to me and say, I read the New York Times for 25 years and I was expecting Beijing to be a very backward, kind of frightening place, and it's actually much better than I thought it was. So certainly if we're giving people that impression, then maybe we're doing something wrong. The other thing, sometimes it's hard to do a good story. If even if you have a positive story, you go to the government, you go to government agencies, they won't even talk about the positive things. So everyone's afraid to talk, and I've had stories where I did a story once on kind of the fish supply in China, and tried to get an interview with the Fisheries Bureau, and they wouldn't talk to me. I found one official from the Fisheries Bureau who came out and talked to me off the record, corrected some of the misconceptions I had. Then I went down and I talked to fishermen in Shandong, but I didn't have permission to go down. I went down on my own, and I was able to back up with confirm what this guy told me. But he broke the rule by talking to me. And I went down illegal without permission to these cities in Shandong, to the coastal areas to talk to fishermen. And so I was able to do a fairer story, but I had to do it in spite of the government. They didn't help me at all, So even, so sometimes even when you try to do something positive, the Olympics, I got rejected for many stories in the Olympics because I didn't have the proper accreditation at the time. So, it's, I don't think the government does
So the control is in fact, to an extent, kind of kicking themselves.
It works both ways. It works both ways. It works both ways. I don't think the government's really learned how to use them. When I was in Taiwan, the government was much better at kind of working with the foreign media and promoting more stories. I don't think they do that much here. But certainly I think you're probably right. There's a lot of negative news that's reported here, but I think there are a lot of bad things that happen. And I think also that a lot of people remember the story about the dying room in the orphanage, but they don't remember the story on the front page about the China selling the most Bentleys or Rolls Royce in a year, or that type of thing.
It leads, and people also remember it, I suppose.
Right.
Now, you've written for the Wall Street Journal, the Chronicle of Higher Education, just about every major American news outlet, for the South China Morning Post, all kinds of publications. What advice would you give to a young person considering a career in journalism in China?
It's kind of completely different than I would have given a few years ago. The industry's it's kind of a bad situation now. A lot of newspapers and magazines are cutting back. They're shutting down. There's less opportunities now, and we're in a real transition period. I meet a lot of people, a lot of young reporters come out, or people that want to be reporters, they come to Beijing. I usually advise them just to start writing, just to, it's hard to get your break if you don't have any experience, but Asia's a great place because you can do something in Beijing or Hong Kong or Jakarta that you couldn't do back home. There's a shortage of people, and I think native English speakers, at least or Western speakers in China compared to back home. So you have a lot more opportunity. You could write an article for Newsweek or Time Magazine or the New York Times here in China that you wouldn't ever get a chance back home. So what I usually advise people is, okay, if you're interested in journalism, you don't have a job, you really have to, if you want to start, the simple way is you go to some small paper in Florida or in New Jersey and you work your way up from a small town newspaper. But I tell people if they come here, if they're interested in Asia, pick something you want to write about, that you feel passionate about, and then you start writing. You just can't keep, a lot of people just keep thinking about, I want to do it, but I think you just go out and you decide, you pick a story and you do it, and then you try to sell it. And that's the advice that I give to people. So, but times have changed, and it's a lot tougher business than it was when I started. I started as a freelancer in Taiwan in 1985, and it's in the last 2 years it's gotten increasingly difficult because of the problems with the media.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.